We've just been talking about some of the reasons to be suspicious of the new hate crime laws which will be introduced in Scotland this week. But it'd be wrong to say that the bill does not also enjoy widespread support, with its proponents making the case that the laws give certain groups some much-needed protection from abuse. So let's talk now to the former SNP Councillor Austin Sheridan. Austin, thank you ever so much for joining me on Free Speech Nation. Can I just begin by asking you, why is it you feel that this new hate crime law is necessary?
I feel that it's necessary because of maybe some of the things that we've actually seen, not just here in Scotland, but across the entirety of the UK. Say, for example, we look at what's happening in the Middle East. We have both Muslims, we have both Jewish people, for example, who feel that they have been targeted, through their religion. At this moment in time, if you look at current legislation, since 1986, we've had legislation that protects people against racism, as in people's race, and everybody in the UK benefits from that. This would simply extend that kind of legislation to cover things like religious background, and it could also cover things like people's sexuality and so on, because no one has the right to be abusive. Absolutely, we have the right to free speech, but we don't have the right to free hatred and to feel discriminate against people.
Can I ask you about that, Austin, because you've specifically mentioned the existing legislation relating to the protected characteristics, which of course are enshrined in the Equality Act 2010. So I'm just curious, what kind of crimes would be covered by this new law that aren't already covered by existing law?
So, for example, it could be, if there's someone outside an abortion centre who's holding up placards, which has been very distressing, towards women. Now, there's separate legislation going through the Scottish Parliament for safe access zones, but some of the things that have been said on those placards have been deemed deeply offensive, have been seen as hateful towards women that are trying to access services. At the moment, the things that are written on those placards aren't covered, and this new legislation would then review what has been said, and then there would be a decision on whether that would constitute as a hate crime. Similar circumstances would be protests. For example, I attended one at the Sandiford Centre in Glasgow, which is a sexual health centre, and it was to do with trans rights, and it was to do with people being able to access transition services through Sandiford. And there was people there holding up extremely offensive placards towards trans people. Again, the current legislation doesn't cover those.
However, actually, can I explore that a little more, Austin?
So it's about making sure that everybody can protest, but also be respectful.
Sorry, just to be clear, what sort of messages are you talking about? Because we all need to understand what it is you mean. So you saw some signs at the protest. Can you give me an example of something that was said on a placard that you think would be covered by this law?
Well, I'll give you an example of something that I watched from one of your shows. I was watching Darren Grimes, and he showed a video of a protester, of a protester saying how he completely supported Hamas, which is a prescribed terrorist organisation. In actual fact, Darren Grimes called for these kind of protests to be banned based on that one man's view. Now, I don't believe that protests should be banned in the form, because I believe in freedom of speech. However, for people that are saying those kind of things that regarding prescribed terrorist organisations, then this kind of legislation
Austin, I just want to be clear though, because I agree with you that protests shouldn't be banned, but I wanted to just be absolutely specific. You said you saw a sign at the Sandiford clinic at a protest that would be covered by the new crime law. I just want you to tell me what it is you saw that you thought would be now criminalised.
Well, if I can recall, it was a while back that I attended the protest, but if I can recall, it was relating trans people to dogs, essentially, which was my recollection. It was reported to the police at the time, and the police informed us that there wasn't anything that they could do, even though it was deemed to be offensive. As I say, but there's many other examples of where that can be the case. As I say, it's not about trying to curtail people's rights to protest. I believe that's fundamental. I believe that people should have the freedom of speech, and people, have the right to debate, certain aspects, whether that's religion, whether it's government policy. People should be able to debate those in a safe and lawful manner. But it becomes a problem when there's people that are trying to use these topics to start marginalising people in our society who more often than not are already marginalised.
The concern there, of course, is that a lot of people are interpreting statements of fact, for instance, as being hateful, trying to stir up hatred, or being transphobic. I mean, for instance, if someone were to hold a sign up at one of these protests which simply said, no human being has ever changed sex. Some people would say that that is hateful and bigoted and should be investigated. Do you agree that that sort of statement should be investigated under this new law?
I think it depends on the context on how something's been said and whether it's been said in a way that is meant to be offensive.
Well, it's on a sign. It's on a sign at a protest outside of Sandyford.
But
what would you say to that? It's on a sign outside a protest at the Sandyford. Or to give a better example, maybe, what if some people have said that the J.K. Rowling ought to be investigated for referring to India Willoughby as male. Should J.K. Rowling be investigated under this new hate speech law, in your view, for that statement?
Well, I've not seen any of J.K. Rowling's statements personally, so I would need to have a look in the context and the manner in which she's in. But if she is intending to misgender someone, on purpose, which to me it sounds like she has, then absolutely. I mean, because why would you go out your way? Why would you go out your way to purposely misgender someone? I don't see what benefit that brings to anyone.
Well,
if J.K. Rowling has views that she's entitled to them, but she's not entitled to make people feel uncomfortable and to go around misgendering people.
No, but do you understand the point that to sustain women's single-sex rights and single-sex spaces, there has to be an acknowledgement of biological sex, and sometimes that will involve calling someone who was born male, who transitioned, who now identifies as female, but identifying them as male. What you've just said would suggest that you think that should be a criminal offence, and I'm worried about that.
No, that's not the case at all. There does have to be acknowledgement in circumstances where, where people's sex, in terms of the sex that they were born, has to be taken into consideration. The best example in Scotland would be the Isla Bryson case, and I think that anybody, in their right mind would agree that that person should not be placed in a female prison. So, of course, there are examples of where people's born sex should absolutely be taken into consideration, and there's no point in denying that's the case because it is biological fact. What I'm saying though is that if there's a case where, say, J.K. Rowling, now I've not seen this, so I'm only using it as a broad example. If there was a case where she has purposely misgendered someone, in order to be offensive, in order to potentially stir up hatred towards someone, then of course that is something that could potentially be investigated. Now, I'm not saying that is the case. I've not seen it, but if that's what your suggestion she has done, then potentially, yeah.
But how would you know? How would you know if her intention is to stir up hatred? How would you know that it wasn't just, for instance, a statement of fact? Let's not forget that India Willoughby has written an awful lot of abusive things about J.K. Rowling. Will India Willoughby now be prosecuted under this new hate crime law?
No, exactly, because this hate crime law applies to everyone, right? So it's just the same way, that the current race legislation applies to every single person in the country, not just minorities. So of course, if there was a valid complaint from J.K. Rowling, towards anyone, where she feels that there's a hate crime being committed, then of course, the police should take the time to investigate that and see if there is merit within that. And that's what I'm saying. That this is a law that protects everyone. I do believe in freedom of speech, but what I don't believe in is freedom of hatred. And in some cases, it would appear to me that the opponents of this bill, which has cross-party support in the Scottish Parliament with the exception of the Conservative Party, that the opponents of the bill seem to mistake freedom of speech to being free to be hateful, and being free to be hateful is not something that should be allowed. But absolutely, we should always do our best to protect freedom of speech and allow sensible and reasonable and measured debate.
Do you really think that
always be done with?
Do you really think that freedom of speech doesn't include offensive speech and the right to say offensive things? I mean, isn't that just part of our freedom as human beings?
No, I don't think that freedom of speech constitutes being free to be, to be hateful towards other people. So for example, if we're going to debate race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, all of these things can be debated. Now, there are people, for example, I supported the gender recognition reform, and there's many people, who were opposed to the legislation, but in terms of concerns that had been raised and their viewpoint, there were very many people who done it in a respectful manner. And in terms of them as people, I would never say they were bad people just because they don't agree with me. The unfortunate thing with the society we live in these days is that if you don't agree with someone, it seems to be that they do their best to try and cancel each other out and call each other hateful. Whereas I think that what we need is a dose of realism and a dose of reality, and to say that of course there's going to be people that can disagree with each other, but we should all be allowed to discuss things, and contribute to the political discourse without being offensive, just like what we're doing today, Andrew.
Does it not concern you, though, Austin, that who gets to decide what is offensive, who gets to decide what is hateful? We've already discussed how some people determine things to be hateful when they're not, when they're just statements of biological fact. In those circumstances, can you really trust the judiciary, the SNP, to make a sensible declaration about where that line is drawn?
Yeah, well, the SNP would never make that decision on its own because the judicial system is separate, from the political system, so that would be a matter for the police and for the courts. And as I say, in terms of guidance, I say all police officers in Scotland, will be trained in what the new law means and what could be deemed as offensive. And I have faith in our police service and our prosecution service, for example, that if there are examples of that, then they'll be able to take that forward. And that should always be without political interference, because it is up to them to implement the law and for those judgments to be passed. It's not for politicians to look at individual cases to decide who's broken the law and who hasn't broken the law.
I suppose my concern is later we're going to be talking to someone who was prosecuted in a Scottish court for posting something online that was grossly offensive. Well, it wasn't grossly offensive to me because it was a joke, but it was grossly offensive to that particular judge. Does the subjectivity of the notion of offence not concern you at all when it's on the statute books?
No, I've spoken to people have concerns regarding things like that. So, for example, it might have been a joke to yourself, but for other people it may have been deemed offensive. But just because something is happening between two people in a private conversation, if there's other people that can be impacted by it, then of course, that is something that the law would have to take into consideration. But there's other examples. Even with current legislation, say for example, if you were in your home, as I do, I live in flats, and you heard, potential domestic abuse happening, I would phone the police. And even if that person's, had been assaulted, and said, I don't want to press charges, well, the police would then say, no, in actual fact, you have been assaulted, there is a case of domestic abuse. And I've reported that as a crime. And even though I had nothing directly to do with it, for example, if someone, has been hateful towards someone else and somebody else, feels impacted by it or feels that person has been unfairly treated, then of course, people have the right to report that to the police, and as I say, for the police to then take that forward. Once the police take that forward and once the prosecution service look at that, it's then up to them to decide whether that goes to court or not.
Well, Austin Sheridan, it's very difficult to get people on this programme who do take your view, so I really genuinely appreciate you coming on to talk about it. That's former SNP Councillor Austin Sheridan. Thank you very much. Very quickly, a response from you, Lois?
Yeah, well, it's striking to me that when Austin was pulling out examples, he was pulling out what he would have deemed to be offensive, for example, outside the Sandyford clinic, outside an abortion facility. I reckon that if somebody had said, no child has ever been born in the wrong body, but Austin and I may have interpreted that differently, and that's the crux of this law. That is the problem. We need to have clear definitions if we're going to ban any speech, and that cannot be achieved, and therefore we must have free speech for everybody.
OK, well, very contentious topic, but it's fascinating stuff.